without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the panel, Matthew Lynch, who is the sustainability coordinator at the UH campuses, all 10 of them, and also the founder of the Asia Pacific Center of Regenerative Design. So thank you, Matthew, for so much. And And I'd like to also invite all the panelists to join us on stage, Camila Mora, Malia Nobrega Oliveira, and Maxine Burkett, who I believe she just stepped out for a bit, and then we'll be back. Thank you. I think mic checks. Hopefully they're all working.
Right on. Thank you so much, Taylor. Thanks, everyone, for sticking around for our discussion. I want to apologize in advance. I've been a bit under the weather this week. I got really cold looking at all that ice. Excuse me. So please bear with I'll try to talk less, let these guys talk more. Also want a big shout out to Civil Beat for pulling this together. Big round of applause, please. So they're live streaming right now. Come join us. They're live streaming on Facebook right now. I'm trying to be subtle about sharing it to the University of Hawaii's Facebook so we can live stream it there too. And when Taylor first reached out and shared her interest in hosting more of these important films and discussions, I could not be more thrilled that she was thinking about this in this way and to partner with it, so I hope to do more. But anyways, I'm really excited to introduce you to this panel. I'll start off with the gentleman to my left, who I gotta admit, Camila, I'm fanboying out a bit right now. Camilo is, bear with me while I read, because they're good bios, so I gotta get it right. An assistant professor of geography at UH Manoa, and his research focuses on biogeography, threats to biodiversity, global conservation assessments, and methods for macroecology, and we'll let him explain what all that means in a moment. Camilo's lab, the Mora Lab, focuses on the interconnected lines of research aimed to understand how biodiversity patterns are generated and modified by human activities, and in the process, identifying conditions where suitable conditions for humans and biodiversity are met. And you may have seen in the papers and also on the internet, his recent research on deadly global heat waves was widely reported all around the world. So please welcome Camilo. Maxine Burkett, to Camilo's left, is a professor of law at the William S. Richardson School of Law, and I am also a very big fan of you, Maxine, at the University of Hawaii, and is also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. She is an expert in law and policy of climate change, has presented her work in diverse areas of climate law throughout the United States, West Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Caribbean. She's been cited in numerous news and policy outlets, including the BBC Radio, I was about to say the failing New York Times, the New York Times, the wonderful New York Times, the International Business Times, and Nature Climate Change. From 2009 to 2012, Maxine served as the inaugural director of the Center for Island Climate Adaptation and Policy. And as director of ICAP, she led projects to address climate change policy and planning for island communities globally. And until recently, Maxine also served on the US Government Federal Climate Advisory Committee, and we might talk about that a little bit. Welcome, Maxine. And then Malia Nobrega Oliveira. It's wonderful to see you again. I feel like it's been a couple years actually since we've last been able to connect. Malia is a faculty member at Hawaii Nui Akea School of Hawaiian Knowledge, which is one of the largest schools of indigenous knowledge in the United States. Malia serves as director of the LAMA program, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of that, so I'll leave it to you later, but it translates to Climate Change, Climate Alert. And this group's mission is to catalyze climate adaptation and resiliency by engaging communities in Hawaii and beyond. Malia's advocacy work has taken her to the United Nations meetings, such as the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the UN World Summit on the Information Society, the UN Conference of the Parties, to the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. She works closely with Indigenous Caucus at these meetings and is currently the international coordinator for the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity, as well as the coordinator of Indigenous Peoples of the Pacific who participate at the CBD and UNFCCC meetings. You can learn more about this work at islandclimate.net. And in addition, Malia works throughout the islands and throughout the Pacific with indigenous peoples throughout. So welcome, Malia. So why don't we start with you, Malia, and then we'll work our way back. I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about the LLAMA program and maybe share what it stands for, the acronym, and specifically maybe share a little bit about how you're engaging and empowering communities throughout Hawaii and the Pacific to rise to some of the challenges that climate change poses.
So aloha kākou. Just really happy to be here today and to be able to watch the film and be here with all of you. So LLAMA stands for Loli Aniau Makaala Aniau and translates to Climate Change, Climate Alert. And as an acronym, LLAMA also refers to these torches, these traditional torches that we would light as a community, whether we went out fishing and for different traditional practices. And as we were coordinating and bringing this program together at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, the idea behind LLAMA was that through education and through our work and engaging communities, that we would be able to light this torch, this LLAMA, in every community and with every ohana. And in our work, that has been our strategy, is really through education and through having these discussions around the kitchen table or even in a classroom with K-12 students, in community colleges, and and just in communities. And more recently, our work, one of our projects has been in collaboration with cultural practitioners like Kalei Nu'uhiwa, who is an expert in our mahina and our moon calendar, and looking at that from a Native Hawaiian perspective. And we've been also partnering with nonprofits like Kama'aha Education Initiative and teaching communities to become kilo, or expert observers who can be out in our community, who are doing work and can be these observers, and to connect it with our moon calendar, and to over time be able to predict and to see these trends. I mean, kind of like what we've seen in the film about photography. I think we, as community scientists, as individuals and as families, we are able to see that in our communities. And I think that has been a very empowering tool for our communities to learn more about how to adapt to climate change, because as Native communities, we've been adapting to these changes, over time. And so it's been exciting to be able to use this platform that comes from a traditional perspective, and to empower our communities to use this and to become kilo, these observers in our communities.
Malia, could you share a little more about kilo, and what are some of the things that communities are observing that are happening right now? And what are some of the ways, strategies and methods and techniques and maybe even sort of deeper philosophies around how to adapt to what they're seeing and what we might anticipate is coming.
Mahalo. So I'll share a personal story that I usually share, and why, and it even answers a question as to why I got involved into looking at climate change and coming from this perspective. And so I'm from Hanapepe, Kauai, which is where my mom is originally from, and this is my mom in the front, Rosalind. And from my mom's side of the family, we are salt makers. And so in Hanapepe, if you've ever been to Kauai, you've maybe been to Salt Pond, and Hanapepe is known for being a salt-producing community. Well, for the last 5 years, this being that 5th year, our ohana, one of 22 ohana, have not been able to produce salt. And this has been a continuous 5 years for our ohana. And we've seen this impact as an impact on our cultural practice because it being so place-based, in some of our discussions, scientists have told me, well, maybe just move the practice. And my response is, well, that's not possible because there are different elements in that place, in that aina, that makes it special so that we can produce salt. So it's not something that we can just move more Mauka or move to the Waimea community or to the Kikaha community. It is something that happens there in Hanapepe and has happened for generations. And when, we see, so as Kilo, going back to the question, I was like, where am I going with this? As Kilo for myself, so after graduating from high school is when I moved to Oahu to start to study at the university. And then just recently, the last 3 years is when I've been back on Kauai with my family. And so Kilo, really, you need to be on the aina. You need to be able to see it on a regular basis and experience the change and see the change for yourself. And so it's been within the last 3 years that I have been able to really document it, whether it be through taking photos on a regular basis. I also have been working with a lot of the other family members to have these discussions and to learn together about the changes we are seeing. And almost every ohana will tell you that climate change is definitely one that we're seeing as an impact on our practice because there's flooding that happens in the area. And so over the last few king tides that have happened, we've seen this correlation between it happening, of course, on the high tide and on the full moon. And in 2015 is when I was able to document for the first time that the waves would be crashing there at the Salt Pond Beach, and it would flow over the sand dunes and flood into the area. So it contributes to the total flooding of the area, which we don't usually see during the summer season because that's when we produce salt. Usually during the winter season, the area is flooded because of rain and the increase of that, but not during our summertime. And so we are taught that when you see the flooding, you're not able to even enter in to start the process. So as Kilo, we can see these different changes, and we also know that the increase of use at the beach, where the cars are going onto the sand dunes, also causes some of that, where the sand dunes are getting flatter and lower. And so there are ways that we are working with the different landowners in the area, whether it be the state or the county, we are moving to possibly close off that part of the beach so that the cars won't have that kind of impact. So it's through being a kilo that we can also inform these kinds of policy making, and then also work with the landowners to make changes into the impacts in the area.
Thank you so much. I think it's so important to, climate change can be such a big and scary thing, and to really like drill down into, similar to the film, but what specifically is happening, it really helps us to understand. Thank you, Malia. Maxine, so President Trump recently,
It's unusual to hear those two words together.
We're gonna
Not
do-
in our household.
Maxine, President Trump.
That's right.
Well, I don't know. I don't know how to segue more awkwardly, but
That's okay. I'm already on a list, so there's no need to. Sorry about that.
President Trump's recent action to dissolve the Federal Climate Advisory Committee, which you were a member of, after he took that action, you were quoted as saying, quote, "This is incredibly unfortunate for our country, and particularly the most vulnerable populations across the U.S." Could you share a little bit more about how that decision may impact vulnerable populations, and maybe some thoughts on what are ways to mitigate or counter some of these anticipated impacts?
Sure. I'll just say first that what this Federal Advisory Committee was charged to do was to assist in making the science more relevant to kilos, right? To the folks that are actually on the ground, that are doing the work at the local community, local, state level. And what we understand about what the charge is for the federal government is that every 4 years, it didn't happen in that increment under the Bush administration, but every 4 years we put out this climate science report, right, the National Climate Assessment, and we're gearing up for that, and the idea was that what happens in between all of these somewhat esoteric chapters on what the impacts of climate change are in various regions or sectors, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this notion of a sustained national climate assessment. What happens in between those 4 years? How do you get with the data we understand about precipitation and variability as a result of climate change to make sense to people that are making decisions about what's on the horizon, whether it's building on the coastline or planting and where you do salt? It's rough. And so what we were charged to make that more relevant. And to say that we were dissolved is more sort of an active term than it really happened. It was very passive. They just didn't renew it, which I think is also kind of a statement on the administration and the decision making that's happening right now. But we had a charter. There was a bit of a delay in start. We met in person twice, but we had a pretty clear charge, which was to make this work. We had a number of subcommittees, all relevant, right? How do we know that we're doing a good job when we put out all the science? How do we get the science to be more effectively, again, translated for decision makers, but also who's using it and who's not using it? I mean, who doesn't have access to this information? So one of the most profound set of conversations I had while on the committee was with Jackie Patterson, who has a really excellent interview in Yes Magazine, if any of you get that. She's being interviewed by Bill McKibben. And she is the director of the NAACP Climate and Environmental Justice Program. And she's talking about what I think a number of us may engage with in our daily lives, but this notion that, climate doesn't, the way I say it, climate doesn't ever meet a virgin, right? Like we live in a world that already has existing vulnerabilities, discrimination, all sorts of things that have brought us to where we are today. And she's describing the need to understand, well, if we're having flooding and we live next to a Superfund site, can you give us some more information about that? I mean, what are the intersections? And so what we understand is that as much as the science is helpful in giving us a broad brush, there are so many different kinds of stories that come about when you're able to apply them to human stories and human lives, and where we live, work, and play, which is the environmental justice refrain. So the spirit of my initial comment for that particular article was to sort of suggest that, look, there's a power element to this. Climate is not just a geophysical phenomenon, it's a geopolitical one. It's one about struggle and history. The communities that are impacted are often in those places that are most vulnerable for historic reasons, and we can't lose that. And the loss of the ability to make that science even better and more actionable for us is a loss to the entire country. It's a loss to the most vulnerable. It's a loss to the entire, I think, human population and obviously other life on Earth. So that was the spirit in which I was staring at.
Thank you. I'm wondering, Maxine, if you could maybe share a bit about what are your thoughts on how can that work continue? What are ways that we might be able to, counter some of these negative actions?
Yeah, definitely. So there were 15 of us that were just specifically about what we were chartered to do in the committee itself. There were 15 of us from around the country. And just one quick anecdote, during our first in-person meeting, there was a sociologist from the University of Oklahoma who's on the team. This was in September. And he's like, his title is like the Gallup professor or something. So he's very much about polling, full on. And he kept saying to us, look, what if this doesn't go the way you think it will, folks? So the rest of us are like, yeah, sure, okay, whatever. It's in the act. They're going to have to follow the act. It's a congressional thing. It's 20-some years old. It'll be done. And he's like, I'm telling you, Riley Dunlap, read his research. He was sort of giving us the signal that this is something that we need to look at, and that the country's the most divisive than it's ever been. And I'll say the composition of the FAC, for short, was industry folks, scientists, academics like myself, lawyers, but these were not activists, and that's why what was so interesting about hearing Balogh talk about the fact that he's like, this doesn't seem like something of an activist do. But this is a very charged group now, especially because of what's happened, and because we had to be in lockstep with what the latest science is. This is not. This is incredibly consequential, the decisions we make around climate. So the bright spot for me is that things are happening in the community level throughout. We have a chief resilience officer who will be on the stage tomorrow. We have a Office of Climate Change. There are local efforts that are so critically important. I know each of us, each of the members of the FAC, we're going to release this report that we were working on. It's going to happen. We're going to find a publisher. I think we'll probably not have too hard of a time given the climate, because people are kind of frustrated by the muffling of important voices and important perspectives, particularly from places like Corpus Christi, where we now know that communities of color are not giving the attention in terms of their relative vulnerability in the face of this unbelievable storm that's hitting right now. So I think the time is even farther along than we were when this movie first came out. There are updates, which I'm hoping, Camila, you can tell us about, right? The science is even a little bit older. It's scarier now, right? And the thing is that we're charged. It's happening at the local level, and that's where it matters, is where people feel this. So
local action. Yeah, thank you. Camilo, so I have a question for you. However, I feel sort of obliged to share some backstory. So a colleague of mine that I work quite closely with the Sustainability Office, we were looking a couple years back for keynote speaker for our annual summit. And she says, you gotta talk to this guy, Camilo. He made everybody in the room cry. He was telling us about the birds and the biodiversity, and it was so sad. And he cried, and we all cried, and you have to have him. So please don't make us cry.
No, this time.
It's already hard enough to watch some of that. And all that being said, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the study that was recently published in, I believe it was the Nature Climate Change Journal. And the study predicted that between, I think, 48 to 74% of the world's population could be at risk from what you termed deadly heat, which the media then took to say deadly heat waves. Your study also showed that these deadly heat waves are actually more common than previously thought. I'm wondering if you could maybe share a little bit more about that study, and then bring it home and talk about what this means for us in Hawaii, and are there other things that we need to be concerned about beyond increasing or potentially deadly temperatures?
Yeah, so Like in this movie, as a scientist, one gets very frustrated about the fact that all of these things are happening. We had done PhDs on these careers, books, encyclopedias of information about how bad this is, and unfortunately, this doesn't resonate with people. I mean, how many of you today are going to walk out of here and do something about climate change? You know, it's already a miracle, I believe, that you are already here. So how do we change that as a scientist, right? So one of the good things about this movie is the fact that it makes people see it, right? The value of that is that it makes people appreciate it. So a few years ago, I decided that I wanted to make a science that people could relate to. And on this specific project, I wanted to find out whether climate change can kill you. What a better way to relate to climate change if you realize that it can kill you? So I decided with my students to look at a heat wave in France, in Europe in 2003 that killed 70,000 people. We're talking about 2 weeks time, 2 weeks, that the temperatures went too high and 70,000 people died. The cities were so unprepared for so many people dying that they were emptying the refrigerators of supermarkets to put the bodies in people in those refrigerators, because the cities couldn't handle all of these people dying from these heat waves. So I said, okay, this is it. This is the heat wave that we're going to be looking at to see what did happen on that specific time that so many people died. Then my students and I discovered that there was another heat wave in Russia in 2010 that killed 15,000 people. Okay, I said, okay, this is now a more complicated story. We already had 2 heat waves. Then we continued looking. We found one in Chicago in 1985 and killed 1,000 people. Okay, 3. Now we were from having something simple to now having something more complicated with 3 heat waves. And I say to the students, okay, we need to start looking into these heat waves. And next thing we know, we start finding out one in California, one in Seattle, one in Toronto. 1 year later, we found 2,000 heat waves when people die. People just dying like crazy from these heat waves, and we're not talking about the amounts that were dying in Paris, in Europe, but about 150, 10 people during these heat waves. We decided to investigate then what were the conditions that kill people on those places, on those times, and what we found is that it's a combination of heat and humidity. And unfortunately, when I made that discovery, it was the middle of this heat wave in Hawaii, and I was terrified. Actually, I told my wife, we need to go and buy an air conditioning. I don't know if you guys remember that heat wave about 2 years ago during the summer that was just like a craziness thing. I mean, I was just taking a shower every 10 minutes during the night just to cool down. And that was the study that we did, and we found that there is a combination of temperature and humidity that kills people. And actually, what kills you is your gut, your intestines. Isn't that interesting? So the way in which it kills you, it turns out that when you get very hot, you are obviously, what's the first thing that happens when you get very hot? You start sweating, right? What happens there is that the hypothalamus in your brain is triggering all of these molecules in your circulatory system to send all of the blood to your skin. Basically, the purpose there of the brain is to cool down. And what it's doing is sending all of the blood from the middle of your body to the skin so that through the process of evaporation of that sweat, you cool down. Unfortunately, when it's humid, that sweat doesn't evaporate. So the blood comes back in hot. Now the heart is just going nuts there because it needs to cool down, so what it starts doing is pumping harder. So that's the reason why you guys feel like your heart starts pumping harder when it gets hot. Well, that again is the process of the brain trying to cool you down. Unfortunately, all of the blood now is allocated to this simple process, and it removes the blood from certain organs that you don't need. And obviously, one of the organs that you don't need when you had a heat wave is your guts. What it does, it removes the amount of oxygen, it reduces the oxygen, and it generates these conditions that are acidic to your guts, and it breaks the lining of your guts. Now, all of these things that are inside your guts now start moving through your circulatory system. There is something in the blood called the white cells, and they say, okay, we are being attacked now because all of this food that you have now is going through your blood. The white cells start attacking that, and basically what happens, now you had a coagulation moving through your body until it gets to your brain, your heart, your kidneys, your lungs, and that's how eventually you die from this kind of stuff. My students and I decided to do a survey of this, and we found that there are 27 ways in which you can die from a heat wave. So this is like a terror movie that you can have 27 endings to choose from.
Aren't we glad we asked? Oh my God.
So now can you relate to it?
Yes, yeah. I think I'm going to cry for a different reason. Oh my goodness. Thank you, Camilo. I think I would like to do is open up the floor to some questions, and maybe we don't have a roving mic, so put your hands up and I'll call on you. Here we go. And what I'll do is I'll get 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll have the panel go. So yes.
I have a question for you, Malia. I'm upset that your family can't make salt. I'm really upset about it because 5 years is a long time. So, I mean, isn't there something is there anything you can do? Like, 5 years is a very long time. I mean, I realize you said you were talking to the landowners, but is there something more that you can do, or is it just nature taking its course in the ocean, waves are flooding it?
Malia, why don't you take that since it was directed at you? Just repeat the question? Yes, absolutely. So the question was, are there things that Malia's family can do to produce salt? And the person that was asking is indicating that upsets her.
Yeah, mahalo for that question. So I will say that although we are one of the 22 families, not all of the families are impacted in the same way, because we are at, even though our elevation may be just a very slight difference in maybe an inch or two, other families around us were able to make salt this year. Maybe about 6 of us in the internal part of the area was not able to make. But I think, what I'm trying to gather now as a kilo or even as ways to adapt is when it does go down low, I've been discussing with my brother just different ways of how we could build up like around our puna or our well, which is where most of the flooding will come from, because that's our main source of water. Normally, we don't build it up like our salt beds. But, and that's one idea that we're having as a ohana is we may need to build up around our puna similarly to how we build up around our salt beds. But just trying to find these natural ways to adapt to this and and we have to try and see if it works. And if not, we go on to the next year. And, in a really good summer, and obviously before all of this has happened, we would, in one harvest, we could harvest maybe about 75 5-gallon buckets. And so it's not like we don't have anything left to use and to share with other families, because we do continue to trade salt with one another. And none of the salt from Hanapepe is sold in stores. And so you would approach a family member and we would be able to trade fish. Or, one of my favorite stories is how my dad really wanted to raise a pig for a baby luau. And he found on Craigslist that ohana on the other side of the family, on the other side of Kauai, was actually looking to trade salt for pigs. And we were able to make that trade. And he would have never met this ohana if he wasn't on Craigslist, looking for, a way to trade and to share, And so, so mahalo.
That's such a great example of sort of modern technology and ancestral wisdom coming together. Papa's on Craigslist and finds the connect for the trade. That's beautiful. So maybe let's go 1, and then I saw a question here, 2, 3. And if you could, I'll keep your question brief so that I can repeat it for the live stream.
I don't understand why people are climate deniers. What is it for them?
Got it. So the question is, why are people climate deniers? We don't understand what's in it for them. Great, thank you. Next question.
Right. Yes, I guess the question
The question is for me specifically, and it is, has the University of Hawaii reached its sustainability goal for last year specifically? I'll take that quickly since it's directed at me. The university has an awful lot of work ahead to achieve its sustainability goals.
Yes or no?
So no, we're still in progress. Yeah, yeah. Third question was here.
Well, it's kind of joint, for Maxine. I've been in California, Hawaii. My children are all born and raised in Big Island, and now I was in California when I was younger and noticed I was, had stuff from smog and everything. So I moved to Big Island and never experienced any heat like, I was there from 70 to 2001 and then moved back my daughter to go to UC system and then back here now to be tutu to my grandchildren because they're all back here. And what you just said is like, I'm really kind of teary about. My son, who's only 28 on the Big Island, is having extreme intestinal problems where he may need surgery, and I'm thinking, is it because of this humidity and heat, because, and also with, what's going on with activists for women and everything, and I'm always preaching, save the seas and the trees and for our children. And I can't understand why people deny either, but what the administration now is trying to erase everything good about what we've come so far. This feels like we're all going to just die.
So question also, why are there climate deniers? Would that be accurate? Okay, and then also specific to your son, is the health challenge that he's experiencing with his intestinal challenges, could that be related to climate change and increasing heat? Let's take one more question right here.
I'd love to hear from each of the panel, what is the one thing that each of us could do that would have the biggest impact to help make a difference?
It's a great question. So the question was, she'd like to hear from each of the panel one thing that we could do to make an impact. So this is our host of questions. Who wants to take a stab at picking one of those first?
I was thinking I would take the climate denier question just because that seems to be a big one, understandably. And there's some interesting social science research on this. And actually, more recently, I saw another report about the fact that it's actually not education level that will predict whether or not you believe the science of climate change. It seems to all be sort of flowing back to this theory around worldview and the differences between worldviews amongst those that receive the information. And it does cut down across demographic lines as well. So you have what researchers have called, actually Melissa Finucane, who used to be up at the East West Center, have called the white male effect, which is purely to describe the demographic likelihood of various perspectives. And without going too deeply into the social science, I can afterwards if you like, it basically suggests that there are different ways that you might think about crises or risks based on your worldview. There is the communitarian view and there is a more hierarchical view. And so even if you believe in climate change and believe the science of it, your solution set will also differ. You may be more interested in nuclear than you would be in community solar, right? So there are sort of personality types and cultural inputs that make a difference, and you actually see that in the numbers when you test when you say survey women versus men on the climate issue, people of color versus non-people of color on the issues, there are going to be differences in that regard. And so it's sort of an uncomfortable social science truth, but it's an important one because we have to understand that it's not just about how smart you are and whether or not you get the science. It really is about a belief system and sort of where you are culturally, what's worked so far. And so there is a bridging that's much bigger that needs to happen here. However, if you look further at the data, most people don't deny climate change. And that, I think, is really what we need to take away from these kinds of conversations. It's so frustrating. It is echoed endlessly on Fox News and other outlets like that. But the vast majority of the country actually does understand that something is awry. And they're experiencing it on the local level. And when we have opportunities to connect the dots, like the number of heat waves that you probably never heard about that we see every day that's happening around the world, these are important pieces to take into consideration when thinking about whether or not we want to focus on changing the denier's mind or focus on the climate despondent, which I'm more concerned about, which is the folks that are concerned. Are we going to just, what's the point? Are we all just going to die? Especially among young folks. When I teach my class, there's the, what you need to know about climate change, where we are or not with the law, and then the hope quotient. What are we going to do about it? You are young lawyers to be. You're empowered. Here are the many different ways that we can move beyond this. The other bit of hopeful news with respect to deniers, and the moral of that story is essentially let's focus on the people that do believe and do have some capacity, because we are in the majority and I think want a different outcome. It's also really important to take into account that we have an administration that's a pretty hard line about it, but we also have scientific or academic papers that have recently come out, great investigative journalism about Exxon being some of the best science on climate change, right? Having had that, but hiding it. So we understand that the denial is about self-interest, maybe about worldview on some level, and that where the truth is coming out inevitably and with a fair amount of force and frequency that I think we can focus on the folks that want to move and act.
Yeah, I'll let you go in a moment, Camila. You said something that I really want to highlight, that those who do not deny climate change science are the majority. I think that's something that's really key for us to focus in on, because it's really not up to us to try to change the minds of the deniers. If we're in the majority, let's focus on avoiding the despondency. We know that there's an issue, we know that we need to act on it. What are the ways that we can act?
And if I can just, a quick addendum, which is to say that there are cultural vouchers, if you will. There are people on the right, for example. My dad is I think he wouldn't say he's a climate denier still, but he was. There are people that are very effective at communicating with their community, right? Who are your trust agents that you're going to put out in that community? Let's support those folks. So if there are folks on the right, there's certainly folks in Congress, former congresspersons that their party platform may vary, but they themselves know that this is a challenge for them. So to the extent that I can support partners across the aisle in various communities, that's another way to sort of fight on both fronts, if you will. But again, with most of our energy towards empowering the people that are right on board.
Thank you, Camilo.
Yeah, I had another simpler explanation to why climate deniers are there, and I think it's based on the economics on this thing. Right now you have big corporations, oil corporations, that have something that is called dead assets. Basically, it's all of this oil that is underground. So if we come together as a species and we are saying we're going to stop this, all of these corporations are going to have dead assets underground. So it's in their interest that this thing never gets resolved. Basically, what they do is they finance these groups to deny the science. And that's the reason why you have things like Fox News always hammering that drum that climate is not real, that this is a hoax. Why? Well, there's corporations paying that kind of stuff so that they feed this misinformation to people. So that's my simple explanation for why there is so many climate deniers, because it's in the economic interest of some corporations to maintain that people ignorant. And actually, it's not ignorant, it's stupid, because they already know stupidity is doing something bad, knowing that it is pretty bad. So yeah, there it goes.
Malia, I'd like to ask you to chime in a moment just before I do. It's interesting what you said about the amount of sheer money that goes in to drive these misinformation campaigns. And I was struck thinking about, what happened with big tobacco, and when the American public realized that these corporate interests have been pulling the wool over their eyes knowingly all of this time. It's interesting because it doesn't matter how much money they threw at it, once your credibility is shot, it's shot. So maybe, through screenings like this and through, building these relationships with those that get it and are active for it, we can cross that threshold at some point. Malia, you want to chime in on some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking about the question on what can we do. And I think the first thing that came to mind for me, because this is what guides a lot of the work I do, and I had said this earlier about traditional knowledge and then the Ike Kupuna, that the source. And, at local meetings or even at international meetings, Indigenous peoples are always seeking that respect for our rights as Indigenous peoples. And you hear the local stories here in Hawaii, whether it be for Mauna Kea or Haleakala or any one of our Vahipana, our sacred sites. And some may wonder, why is that connected to climate change, you know, but it really is. Yeah, I mean, there's that deep connection of respecting and knowing the people that are from Hawaii and from this Aina, and how that is related to just all of our existence, that we all live here in Hawaii, and how we can all coexist here, you know, is really through respecting the native people of this Aina. The second thing that came to mind that I've been, you know, working on as a ohana and also as a community back on Kauai is really being connected to supporting our local economy, whether it be our mea'ai, our food, you know, our local farmers, and just all of our local businesses and entrepreneurs, and making a commitment to that. In our recent partnership back on Kauai is with the Chancellor of Kauai Community College, as well as the Climate Change Coordinator under the County of Kauai, and also some of our professors at Kauai Community College. But we've been going out into different communities on Kauai to really sit one-on-one and have these discussions. And I think, again, participating and inviting people to come into your community and to sit with your ohana, with your young ones in the schools, I think can really make a difference, so that we can have these kinds of conversations, share these kinds of initiatives, and come up with solutions together as a community.
Yeah, thank you, Malia. I'd like to pick our other two panelists' brains about solutions and maybe an action that we can do. I know at the University of Hawaii, to your earlier question about have we met our sustainability goal, we have a number of sustainability goals. So as an example, one of the actions that we're taking, UH has a net zero energy by 2035 mandate. Now we're about between 1% and 2% of the way there, so we definitely have not hit that goal and have much work to do. However, one of the bigger questions that we're also asking is, how is it possible that a student can go through the university, graduate, having not been exposed or taught the basics of climate change and the science behind it, that it is happening, and how it may impact you in whatever your discipline or field of study or future career may take you? And this is a question that we have made good progress on with the establishment of the sustainability framework. There are now over 250 courses offered across all 10 campuses, and we're working right now on developing a system-wide certificate, which would be a minor equivalent to sustainability that's targeted to address those questions. So it's just an example of one of the actions that we're taking institutionally at the University of Hawaii. Maxine and Camilo, your thoughts on what are some actions that we might be able to do at home or in our communities?
Yeah, so that is an excellent question. And I think personally, I feel that you got the time to stop talking and start doing. Yeah, and along those lines, about 3 years ago, we came out with this idea called the Carbon Neutrality Project. And there is a huge irony about climate change, because all of us are here and we stay longer because we believe in climate change, but there is a huge irony about it, is that most of us are gonna go and drive a car that is gonna produce CO2, right? But how can you say to yourself, I wanna go there, but I don't wanna drive the car? Obviously, you have to start doing a lot of sacrifices if you really want to fix climate change. So the idea of the carbon neutrality challenge is the fact that as an individual, we produce CO2. Our own survival, the quality of our lives, is depending on producing that CO2. Right now, we are enjoying a good time here because we have air conditioning that is producing a lot of CO2, right? But that's a sacrifice that we cannot give up. So how do we live? Even when we believe in climate change, we are producing CO2. So the idea of the carbon neutrality challenge is that we went and we took the databases of all of the trees from Hawaii, and we calculated how much CO2 those trees will sequester. So we right now had a database, and you will know if I plant this tree, this is how much CO2 that tree will sequester. So as an individual, you calculate how much CO2 you produce. Right now, the average American produces 20 tons of CO2 a year. That will require you to plant about 20 trees in that year, and you will become carbon neutral. Yeah? What we want to do, though, is in a web page that we are almost done with it, is you go and calculate your emissions. So say you, after you enter all of the things that you do, you produce 20 tons of CO2. You go and plant trees, you plant 5 trees. So your deficit is 15 tons. You will need to plant 15 more trees. But I might have gone the same day and I planted 10 trees. So my deficit now is 10 tons. So I am better than you are. The web page is going to tell you that. The web page is going to tell you that I am ranking better than you are, and you're going to get a message saying, hey, you want to beat Camilo, you need to go and plant 5 more trees.
Plant some trees, huh?
What we want to do, again, that's the idea of the challenge. Did you guys ever look at that thing, the ice bucket challenge? That's what I figure, making people take the challenge of becoming carbon neutral for 1 year. And I figure we can make that happen here in Hawaii. We can make an example for the entire world that we can become carbon neutral. That's the day that climate change will be fixed, the day in which the footprint of every one of us gets removed from the atmosphere. In 100 years from now, history is going to look back. If this problem gets fixed, history books are going to be looking back and see where did climate change got fixed. Wouldn't it be sweet if the history books were to tell you that climate change got fixed here in Hawaii? Huh?
Camilo, I accept your challenge. I will see your trees and raise you 5.
All right. You're welcome to come. We are actually planting trees as we speak right now.
Oh, great. Thank you. Maxine.
Right. That's so. I'll take that, which is to say, well, couple things. One is that there's always this. You live in dissonance when you do this work, right? I mean, I just want to also acknowledge that. I think every day we wake up and think about climate change like a million times more than the average person, right? And there's just a barrage of information. I still sit in that seat and I'm still just completely jaw-dropped in seeing the images and watch. So I just want to just sort of have some moment of communion on that because it really is pretty striking. And there is a lot of irony in living in this space of knowing what we know and doing the work that we're doing and living in the world. I had a transatlantic flight, a pretty long one because I was in Morocco for the COP last year, and I was sort of also admitting how sort of silly I was when I was younger. But I remember when I take transatlantic flights, I have family in London, I would just go, there was always this patch that was cloudy. I was like, why is this patch always so cloudy? It was Greenland, right? It was ice, it was a glacier. And I flew back this time and it finally clicked, and now we have the maps and you can see where you are. And I saw this I have photos of it with the Swiss Air, with the wing, right, in the image, and I just thought, oh my God, you know, this is again like one of those moments where you're living your life. We're sitting in this freezing room, we're sitting in our freezing campus offices, and we still live in the system. And so, acknowledging that there is a systematic problem here is also very critical. So obviously, every day, our light bulbs, our electric cars, our tree planting, critically important. We can't forget that we're in the system. And for some reason, as we were talking, I was thinking about this. I was listening to this sort of science. With my kids, I listened to this science podcast. And this episode was called Secrets. And it was basically about how various organisms speak to each other in ways that we don't understand. And so when one tree in a forest is attacked in some way, whether it's a fungus or something's knocking, whatever, it sends out secret signals to the other trees to take up their defenses and to essentially act out. And to me, it seemed to me that there was a story there because again, we humans, our nature also defending itself. And I think to the extent that we can see ourselves as getting that signal and being told it's time to be a part of, understand that this is a systemic threat, and we have to protect ourselves, but also tell others, and be activists about it. That's essentially the most active, subversive moment for a tree, right? Be like, hey, folks, let's let them know that this is a stress that we will protect ourselves against. And so, who are we acting against? I think each one of us, the perils, the possibilities of climate change is that it it's not just one thing, right? I mean, each of us will be impacted by that, which means by virtue of our place in society, each of us has something to say about it. If you're a geologist, if you are, obviously you can help your community members, go to those communities that are stressed about what are the impacts of flooding in my community. If you are a gardener, think about how you're going to do food differently or participate in food security for your community or for larger systems, plug in somehow. There's no way that you're not impacted by this. One of the biggest things that I have to convince people at the law school is that climate change is, I think, as important as contracts at this point. I mean, like, how can you practice law and not understand what's coming down the pike for all of your clients? There's nothing that any of you, everything that you do has to be seen through this lens at this point, and see that as a privilege, because there was nothing like after the election talking to my mom, who has lived her life, born a colonial subject in Jamaica, and is thinking about, leaving this earth with it as it is right now, and trying to convince her that she was empowered, right? And so each of you has that capacity, and I think we need to just embrace that as an honor and a privilege.
Thank you, Maxine. Yeah. It's such a, it sounds like a great note to close this panel on. The idea of doing what we can where we are with what we have, and knowing that we're not alone in that it takes all of us for systemic shift to happen, it takes all of us doing our part wherever we are in that system. So before we formally close the panel, once again, would like to thank the Honolulu Museum of Art, Taylor Chang, would like to thank our partners at Civil Beat, and please give it up for our wonderful panelists. Thank you. If anyone has any lingering questions, we'll be around up here for another 5-10 minutes or so. Otherwise, enjoy your day. Thank you, Taylor.